I'm David Wilcock, and this is Wisdom Teachings. Are we seeing dramatic planet-wide changes in Mercury and in Venus? Things like massive increases in magnetic field strength or brightness. And are we even seeing such things as physical, structural changes in the actual shape and size and location of elements on the planets themselves? Are these changes further proof that we are indeed moving into a more energetic region of the galaxy and thus fulfilling ancient prophecies regarding ascension and the transfiguration of what it means to be human? That's what's coming up in this week's episode of Wisdom Teachings. Mercury is where we're going to start in this episode, and let's be clear that you may have been misinformed by classes that you had in the regular corporate governmental educational system, in which we were kind of led to believe that Mercury was this really hot molten planet of some kind. Mercury is not a hot molten ball at all. In fact, once we actually got better views of Mercury, we discovered that it started to look a lot more like the moon than anything else. And the curious fact was that in the earlier probes that had gone past Mercury in the 1970s and in the 1980s, there was no magnetic field discovered whatsoever. That's right. Mercury was essentially like a dead planet. And without a magnetic field, it would have no protective mechanism against any particle emissions from the sun and bombarded by things. Now, again, there's no molten material on the surface of Mercury. This is a very archaic notion. It actually does have ice craters. It actually does have areas that are shaded. So even though it's that close to the sun, you have to think differently than how you've been taught. But the real interesting stuff started to happen when the Messenger space probe visited Mercury in 2008. Mercury was the straggler. It was frustrating me for so long. I had found Dmitriev's paper back in 2000, and I had looked and looked and looked for any information suggesting weird changes going on with Mercury, and I simply could not find them. It was so frustrating. And I knew, however, that this was a predictive model. In other words, science is about making predictions, and then if your model is correct, the predictions then come true. So the predictive model suggested that we would find evidence that Mercury was undergoing energetic change. And it wasn't until 2008 that that actually came to be. So here we go with the exact description of what happened. In 2008, NASA made a statement saying the magnetosphere and magnetic field of Mercury during the Messenger space probe's flyby appeared to be different from that of Mariner 10, which was in the 1970s. Messenger found that the planet Mercury's magnetic field was generally quiet, but it showed several signatures indicating significant pressure within the magnetosphere. Now, Mariner 10 didn't show any magnetic field at all, so this was a very, very bizarre change. Here we see a description of when this was first announced. This is from January 30th, 2008. NASA spacecraft streams back surprises from Mercury. Very different than what it looked like 30 years ago. That means that it has changed quite a bit since, as it says at the bottom, Mariner 10 flew by on March 16th, 1975. So in just over 30 years, it goes from no magnetic field to a significant magnetic field, and that's pretty awesome. Here's another article that shows where this was going on. Mercury delivers the unexpected, January 31st, 2008. This is on ABC. And it says, there's the peculiar change in the planet's magnetosphere which showed no trace of the energetic particles found during the Mariner flybys in 1974 and 1975. So this is not the planet we expected, says Dr. Sean Solomon. Now, another one shows up a year later. Messenger is now flying around, and in 2009, they find magnetic tornadoes. And these magnetic tornadoes were completely not seen even in 2008. And remember, in 1975, they had nothing. There was no magnetic field at all. So how do you go from detecting one in 2008 to having whole entire tornadoes that were not seen before in 2009? This is signs of a rapid, unbelievable, energetic transformation. The reason why there was no magnetic field in 1975 is that it didn't exist. But as we move into this very magnetic region of interstellar space, everything is building up a magnetic charge. It's in the same way that that old experiment I did as a kid, where you take an iron nail and you stroke it with a magnet, you stroke it, and eventually the iron nail becomes magnetized. So this is appearing to be what's happening to Mercury, that it's actually building up a magnetic charge, but it's really amazing. Take a look at this image and you'll see some of the magnetic signs of pressure. It says, this second Mercury flyby provided a number of new findings, said Sean Solomon, the probe's principal investigator from Carnegie Institute. One of the biggest surprises was how strongly the dynamics of the planet's magnetic field solar-wind interaction had changed from the first Mercury flyby in 2008. And the photos also revealed a previously unknown mammoth crater spanning 430 miles, but they just hadn't seen that before. So now I want you to pay close attention to the blue here, because the blue is where the magnetic fields are. Now this is the whole planet. And so what we're looking at here, really amazing stuff, is that all of those blue areas that you see are magnetic fields that did not exist before. So this is really radical change on a very, very massive level. And when I normally would do this talk and talk about interplanetary climate change, which was something that was very much a part of my platform for 5 years that I did conferences every month, I would never really have much more to say about Mercury. But in order to give you the most current and amazing information that I can for this show, I've gone back and I wanted to make sure that I hadn't missed anything. And it's funny, but one of the classic words that NASA always seems to use, that you can have in your quiver as an arrow when you're trying to fight this war to look for these things, is the word unexpected. Unexpected shows up all the time. So you take the name of the planet, the word planet, and unexpected, and pop that in there. And as I did this for this shoot, I discovered there were new surprises of Mercury that I hadn't seen, which actually also seen until I put these slides together in the last few months. So this is really cool. Let's take a look. It actually was announced in July 2008, right around the time that Messenger started to get really good high-resolution images, that Mercury was shrinking. This is very, very bizarre. And here is a link from New Scientist, a reputable magazine called Mercury, the Incredible Shrinking Planet. Now, what they noticed is visible right here. And no, this is not like some kind of face on Mars thing or architecture, although maybe it is. I mean, who the heck knows, honestly, because we are seeing some pretty cool straight lines where the arrows are located. But nobody's saying, in this case, that these are square craters or straight lines, even though you could kind of argue they might be. What they're calling these is escarpments, and they're saying that this is areas where the actual mass of the planet is collapsing on itself, and thus the surface features are folding over each other, creating these folds, and you can even see that they're folding where the craters are in some cases. So you look at those arrows and you see this is where the actual interior, so they believe, the interior of the planet is getting smaller, and then the surface, which is already hard crust, is now folding on top of itself, making these curious formations. So here's where New Scientist describes this. The solar system's smallest planet has been shrinking at an unexpected, there's the magic word, unexpected rate, researchers announced on Thursday. When NASA's Mariner 10 probe flew by Mercury in 1974 and 1975, it returned images of strange cliffs called scarps that cut across all sorts of geological formations, meaning they cut through them, including mountains and including craters, right? That cut across all sorts of geological formations, meaning they cut through them, including mountains and including craters, right? That suggested that the planet's surface has contracted over time. And obviously more recently, because as you see again in this image, you look down at where those three white arrows are near the bottom, there's a crater across that scarp. And that means that the crater is probably older than the scarp is. Or it's also called an escarpment. Scarp is just a shortened word for escarpment. So, now pictures of Mercury's surface taken with NASA's Messenger spacecraft confirm that the crust appears to have buckled. In fact, the planet seems to have shrunk more than previously thought and may still be shrinking. The new result comes from an analysis of pictures snapped when the spacecraft whipped past the planet on January 14th and photographed a previously unseen 20% of Mercury's surface. So they had no visuals on this before. Mariner 10 images suggested the planet's radius, which is roughly 2,400 kilometers, has shrunk by 1 to 2 kilometers since its formation more than 4 billion years ago. Okay, well, that sounds pretty boring, right? Oh man, wait a minute, 4 billion years? But wait a minute, no, we're talking about mountains being folded, we're talking about craters being folded. This is way more recent, and they even make it clear. So what they're saying is that the shrinking of Mercury that they thought they knew about is an underestimate. In other words, it's been shrinking much more recently. The new SCARP images, which were taken from a better angle relative to the Sun than Mariner 10, show that the planet seems to be shrinking by at least a third more than previously thought. Okay, possible. And if so, is it possible that Mercury had looked differently between 1975 and 2008 because that shrinking has actually been occurring since 1975? What does the slide say? At least a third more shrinking than they previously thought. Previously meaning 1975. So we have to consider the possibility that Mercury actually has shrunk since 1975. And that is a very active thing. Now, it's weird because why might that be happening? In the conventional scientific view, they think that the interior of a planet is molten. But that's not what I've been saying. Once we get into later episodes coming up, when we get into the global grid and all the ley lines on Earth, and you're going to be blown away when we get into that stuff, trust me. You definitely want to stick around for that. We're going to show also the expanding Earth hypothesis. The idea that if you actually take the Earth and you remove the oceans as if that mass didn't exist and you fit the continents together, you can shrink the Earth down to 55% of its current size. All the continents fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And then we can model by the actual seafloor expansion rate that the Earth is expanding from within just since about 225 million years ago. And that in fact, the oceans are where new water is coming in from the solar system, hydrogen and oxygen blending from the star's output, and then raining down and filling these gaps where the original molten crust has cracked and broken apart. The area underneath is thinner, and then the water rains on it and pushes it down, thus creating oceans where they didn't exist. So now planets are growing, suggests that the planet has some kind of energetic core, some kind of plasma light. In fact, the idea I said in previous episodes about natural self-luminous formations, in which gravitational energy turns into electromagnetic energy, that appears to be what's going on inside the planet. That the planet is having gravitational energy coming in, it's transforming into light inside the planet, and that light is actually growing and it's creating mass. That matter is being created as this gravity turns into electromagnetic energy, because matter is ultimately electromagnetic energy. So the Earth is growing. And in the case of Mercury, it's right near the Sun as the Sun is going through this massive energetic charge up, getting ready for this big flash. So here's what I propose. I propose that the Sun is drawing in energy from its surroundings, because it's getting ready to do something really big. And as it's drawing in that energy, it's actually sucking it out of Mercury's core. It's wicking that energy out, and it's shrinking. And what's really interesting about this is that Mercury is shrinking in a very strange geometric way. It is not shrinking uniformly all the way around. It's shrinking more in one hemisphere than the other, which gets back to our idea, as we talked about in previous episodes, of a tetrahedral energy inside the planet. But don't take my word for it. Let's hear it from NASA. So here is a mainstream NASA-based press release talking about how Mercury is shrinking and that the contractions are not occurring in the way they'd expected. I believe this comes from the Smithsonian Institution. The new research contradicts the existing model of it shrinking all the way around the same way. Messenger has found distinct patterns in the orientations of the fault scarps and clear concentrations in the number of scarps. Many scarps are concentrated in two broad longitudinal bands. Well, what is a longitudinal band but the evidence of a geometric shape, just like the tetrahedron that we were talking about in older episodes? There it is again, longitudinal bands, hyperdimensional geometry. Even more surprising is that the majority of the largest fault scarps, those with lengths greater than 100 kilometers, are found in one hemisphere of Mercury. There it is, boom. Not the other, but in one. There are almost 3 times more of these large lines, large faults, in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere. 300% more. That is totally not the way that regular planet models work, but it absolutely fits with what we're now seeing in this hyperdimensional model, where we have geometry that actually absorbs energy and is the force that causes these earthquakes and volcanic eruptions to occur, which is going to become a lot clearer when we get into the global grid. Where the geometry is, the planet's actually folding along the lines. And the more we study this, I believe that will become very, very obvious. There's more research that needs to be done here. This is pretty lopsided, the scientist says, and not what you would expect from a body that is contracting in a uniform way. According to Waters of the Center of Earth for Planetary Studies at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, the pattern in orientations and the hemispheric dichotomy in the number of large faults suggests we're missing something. So clearly, this is one of those weird things about Mercury that doesn't give any credence to this model of a uniform crust, but does very much support the idea of geometry in which one hemisphere can be more active with these lines than another. Just like you have the great red spot or the great dark spot active in one hemisphere, one tetrahedron, if you will, is going to predominate over the other one, and its points will then be where the action is. So you're going to get these longitudinal effects, just like they showed here. And there's one last thing interesting about Mercury I want to share with you before we get to Venus, and that is these weird bright blue formations that were announced in 2011. Pretty cool stuff. And it was announced here from Carnegie Institution in this press release, where these huge expanses of volcanic plains surround the planet, covering more than 6% of the surface. That's one of the things they talk about. But I'm going to spell out for you the really key part here. Messenger revealed an unexpected class of landform on Mercury and suggested that a previously unrecognized geological process is responsible for its formation. Images collected during Mariner 10 and Messenger's flybys of Mercury showed that the floors and central mountain peaks of some of the impact craters are very bright and have a blue color relative to other areas of Mercury. So why was this unexpected? Because it shows that Mercury is getting some kind of ice, which suggests that it has an atmosphere. And again, we're seeing it's growing a magnetic field. So it's having water come in. It's getting these weird, icy, bright spots. That's all very unusual stuff. Analysis of the images and estimates of the rate at which the hollows may be growing lead to the conclusion that they are actively forming today. So it means it's expanding. The old conventional wisdom was that Mercury is just like the moon, But from its vantage point in orbit, MESSENGER is showing us that Mercury is radically weird blue shapes that suggest a lot more ice than it's supposed to have. It's close to the sun. There's supposed to be a solar heating effect. We used to think that it would melt all that kind of stuff. Now we're seeing, nope, there's something going on here. Something very, very unusual and spectacular. So when we look at this planet and we see how the planet is shrinking down in size, it gives us a lot of insight into what the sun is really doing, that the sun could be drawing in this energy, and some of what we see on Venus is very similar. Venus has stunning changes. Let's go through some of them now, and I may have to cover more in the next episode. We'll see how it goes. The first one is the one that you've probably heard me talk about before. It's something I go through all the time. A 2,500% increase in the green glow on the night side of Venus. That green glow, you can see it right there. And it is something that is caused by oxygen ions. So this is activated oxygen. Now, what's really cool is we're going to see a little later is that Venus used to have a lot more sulfur in its atmosphere, and the sulfur is being oxidized. It's being replaced by oxygen. So what's happening is that Venus is getting this brightness from somewhere, but we don't really know where it's coming from. The brightness is unusual because if it's 2,500% brighter just since 1978, that's a massive, massive change. It's as if the whole planet is lighting up and it's glowing in a funny way. Now, I want you to also look very carefully at that green line and tell me out loud, I'll hear you. Now, I want you to also look very carefully at that green line and tell me out loud, I'll hear you psychically. Tell me what you actually see there. Well, I've done this in some of my other slideshows, but if you draw a triangle along that line up to the north tip of Venus, and then you take that red area as if it was the base of an equilateral triangle, then sure enough, what we see is that there is a hidden equilateral triangle in the way that that oxygen is emerging. So my proposition, as I said in a previous episode, is that that is actually caused by a tetrahedron geometry inside Venus. That in fact, as Venus is getting charged up, there's this hyperdimensional geometry, if you will, inside the planet. And that energy is getting a massive increase in charge. As it charges up, in this case, it's releasing oxygen ions in an area that used to only be dark. And those oxygen ions are actually leading to a visible line. So you can literally see the line where the geometry is located. This is not Photoshop. There's no special tricks here. And just to show you this, I want to go to the next slide where you can see now some of the previous levels of what was going on here. So these are 6 different images of Venus that all are taken of the night side. So you can see that where it's blue is the night side and where it's white is where the sun is hitting. And notice that it doesn't always appear. The weird geometric pattern is only on the bottom right, but it's extremely, extremely perfect in its symmetry. You can draw lines over it, as I've done before, and with similar geometric changes that we're seeing in Mercury, because Mercury had these scarps appearing in longitudinal lines and concentrated more in the southern hemisphere than in the northern hemisphere. Well, we see on Jupiter, the great red spot is in the southern hemisphere. We're seeing here on Venus that the bulk of this geometric line is in the southern hemisphere. And we're also seeing 3 times more of these types of folds in the southern hemisphere of Mercury. So we have a whole new model to enjoy and play around with here that radically changes our view of what is going on with Mercury and with Venus now. They're both doing very similar things. So just to drive home the point about the oxygen, here is a NASA statistic regarding the sulfur. Between 1978 and 1983, and you can see there Venus, that's as much as they'd imaged back when I first saved that image. There's been a dramatic decline in sulfur gases, and here's the link to this. This was done in Scientific American magazine as a joint effort between Dr. Larry Esposito of NASA and Drs. Bullock and Grinspoon. So together, what they found is that Venus is going through something totally is not breathable for human beings. Sulfur is a toxic gas that in smaller concentrations, of course, it smells like rotten eggs, but in larger concentrations, if you breathe too much of it, it will kill you. Oxygen, however, is much more something that we can breathe, something that we can live with. So we're seeing that all the things that make Venus toxic, so that we couldn't live there, are disappearing. The sulfur is going away at a dramatic rate. You saw it right there from NASA. And then the oxygen is coming in. It appears to be coming in through this hyperdimensional geometric shape. And that is very exciting because the shape suggests that there is truth to this notion of sacred geometry where it multiplexes its way through all these different levels of the universe. And I've showed you some very, very amazing stuff. I talked about how the actual shape of the universe itself is this big octahedron tilted on its side, and that the original Merkaba that it all appears to have expanded from has that octahedron in it as well. If you look inside the Merkaba and you take the centers of everything. Well, then we showed how superclusters of galaxies are all clustered in these geometric patterns, and you can see that by looking out around us now. There's these big geometric shapes with nothing else in between them, only galaxies clustering along the lines. I also showed you how galaxies themselves, the arms of the galaxies, are bending according to these geometric patterns. And the same geometry is being seen inside planets. So this is compelling because it says that this is a hyperdimensional change. It's these geometric grids that are really activating. They're charging up, they're charging up, they're transforming. And in the next episode, I'm going to go into Venus even more. And I'm going to show you some really, really compelling proof that was discovered on Venus that gets into the whole nature of what we know about this weird hyperdimensional model where you have 19.5 degrees north or south and these strange vortexes that appear. On the gas planets, you see the great red spot like on Jupiter or the great dark spot like on Neptune. On solid planets, you're seeing volcanic activity suggesting something swirling inside the crust. Well, wait till you see what we've got on Venus, and I've only begun to share with you some of the amazing changes that we're going to see as Venus is transforming. There's a lot more coming up here for Wisdom Teachings. I'm your host, David Wilcock, bringing you the information you need that will set you free. Thanks for watching.